Good evening.
Evening, Rabbi.
How you doing?
Good. How about you?
I'm all right. Just getting everything set up in place. And that's looking about right.
Rabbi, do you know anything about the Nachmanides synagogue in Jerusalem?
I know a little bit about its history. I know that it was severely destroyed, damaged during the War of Independence. I know that it has since been restored and renovated and is quite lovely, but I don't know much more than that.
All right. I think I'm reading a book by one of the rabbis there, Benjamin Lau, Rabbi Benjamin Lau. Have you heard that? You probably haven't heard that name then, huh?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of Rabbi Laus that are quite well known, but I don't remember a Benjamin Lau off the top of my head. There are both too many and too few rabbis in the world. Too many only because it means I don't get to know them all. Too few because we always could use more. All right, well, I don't believe that we're going to have our other regular Zoom connector, and if someone else pops in, that's great. So let's go ahead and get started because we've got a lot of preparatory work today. Now, we went through mikvah in our last Mishnah session, primarily because I wanted to lay the foundation of some of the concepts of the transition between tameh and tahor, between ritually impure and pure. And yes, I will generally use the term tameh and tahor because it's easier to use the Hebrew than it is to use the imperfect English equivalents. It's kind of confusing, I know, when you're first getting started because they both begin with a t sound. But again, tahor is to be ritually pure, which means, generally speaking, fit to be at the altar in Jerusalem. And tameh means ritually impure, which means not ritually fit to be at the altar. There are a number of other things that will come up, but that's just sort of the shorthand. Now, this concept of tameh and tahor is very unfamiliar in the modern world. We do have a few echoes of it, and Niddah is in fact one of the strongest echoes of it, but it's going to need a little bit of focus. Now, before we get into this general introduction, which is taken from the Masorah edition of the Mishnah, let me just put up a big sort of I don't want to say caveat because there's nothing to be warned about, but the subject of Niddah is the subject of in general, the cycle of a woman's monthly menstrual cycle. And in our modern world, which has been heavily tainted by puritanical Victorian sensibilities, that topic is one that people shun. They treat it as though it were disgraceful. They treat it as something that should only be whispered behind hands and never discussed. There are people who will avoid whole sections of the supermarket for fear of seeing the products for this topic. That is not the way Judaism discusses this topic. Obviously, it's in the Torah, or else we wouldn't be having the conversation at all. And throughout our history, Judaism has had a very frank and very neutral understanding of this process of the human body, just as it has a very frank and neutral discussion of other processes of the human body, male, female, or across all of us. So just set aside whatever cultural hangups you might have from the Western ideas about this topic. This is something that we're going to treat frankly. I'll still try to use polite language just so people don't go running off into the night screaming of how dare you talk about this thing too bluntly, but we'll still need to speak about things fairly directly. So that's my little introduction. If you can't handle that, okay, contact me and we can talk about why you're unable to talk about these topics in our discussion. If you can handle that, great. If you're not sure, stick around and see how we go. Now, the other caveat I have to put on this is because of the treatment of Niddah as though it were a taboo by Western society. That means that some of that has leached into some Jewish thinking and Jewish ideas. Not just recently, but even going back a few hundred years, there are some within the Jewish community that treat this as though it is a defect that needs to be fixed or avoided at all costs. And that's simply not the way that our classical text deals with it. And it's not the way that we're going to deal with it. We're going to deal with it with the way the Torah talks about it. This is something that happens each month. We need to know how to relate to it. And we're going to discuss it the way the Mishnah and, to another degree, the Talmud and medieval halacha deals with it before it begins, again, being tainted by outside influences over these topics. So there is no inherent stigma or negative connotation. This is simply a quite literal fact of life that has certain ritual implications, but it should not be construed as being either positive or negative for those implications. Okay, one last little warning, which we'll talk about a bit more as we get going with this introduction here, and that is that if you are somebody who has kept Taharat Mishpacha, which is the family purity category of mitzvot, which is a whole cluster of how we deal with these issues in our contemporary halachic life, then you may notice as we go through the Mishnah that it doesn't quite seem to match the way that this is observed in most observant communities to this day. And that is because of certain changes and institutions that were put in place during the Talmudic and post-Talmudic period, which means hundreds of years after the Mishnah. So we will, at the very, very end, when we finished all of the chapters of Niddah, we can discuss some of the modern takes on this topic and where this change happened and why. But for the moment, just be prepared that what we discuss here in the Mishnah is going to seem a little different than what you might have heard about how people observe this mitzvah in contemporary observant communities. I'll point out a few things as we go, but I don't want to dwell on it until we've done the whole Mishnah, and then we'll do a sort of a follow-up class, just like we did for mikveh, talking about how to build a mikveh in the modern world, etc. All right. So that's already 8 minutes of introduction. Let's get down to the actual text of the introduction. Once again, this comes from the Masorah translation of the Mishnah. Women of childbearing age who are not pregnant or nursing generally have a monthly cycle of menstruation, which is a flow of blood from the womb. Hopefully, I don't need to explain it in more detail than that. All of you have had a basic understanding of sex education. If not, there are many more resources online to fill you in on how that works that will be better than me. The Torah decrees that this flow makes a woman tameh, again, ritually impure. Tractate Niddah, the section that we're dealing with, deals primarily with this tumah, this ritual impurity, and with the procedure for becoming tahor from it, for becoming ritually pure. A woman who experiences a flow of blood becomes tameh as either a niddah, and that's the Hebrew word, and you see the transliteration, or a zava. Now, zava is a different type of ritual impurity that still is triggered by a flow of blood. And we're going to be talking a lot about how you tell the difference between one or the other. But in general, this is depending on the point in her monthly cycle that the flow occurred, as we will see below. A woman who gives birth, known as a yoledet, is also tameh, even if there is no blood discharged at the time of birth. So we have 3 different ways that a person can become tameh through the blood that is coming from the womb. One is known as niddah, one is known as becoming a niddah, one is becoming a zava, and one is a yoledet. The tumot of niddah, zava, and childbirth are identical in almost every way. Additionally, all 3 types of tumah require that the women immerse themselves in a mikveh in order to become tahor. There are, however, differences between them relating to the length of the tumah and the tahara, the purification, procedures, as will be explained below. These tumot have twofold effect. First, A woman with any of these tumot is an av hatuma. That is to say, she is a primary source of tuma. We talked about that in our summary about ritual impurity last week. Second, a woman who is a niddah, zava, or who has given birth is an erva. This is a technical term. Don't try to translate it. What that means is she is forbidden to cohabit with a man. And if she does, they are both punished with karet. Karet is known as spiritual excision. It's considered a very severe type of punishment for a transgression. Of course, a person can do teshuvah, repent, and mend that. If they sinned unintentionally, they must both bring chatat offerings. All these laws apply whether a woman is married or unmarried. So when a woman has this tumot, she has this ritual impurity, then she can transmit it as an av hatuma, and it also means that intimacy is prohibited in and of itself. Now, those are both two different issues. Sometimes they get conflated. People think that if somebody is ritually impure, that it's impermissible to cohabit with them. In general, that's not the case. It is true that you will become ritually impure, but there can be reasons to go ahead and have intimacy and contact with a person during that time. But when somebody is a niddah, it is prohibited to have intimacy with them. And we'll talk about some of the different degrees of intimacy as we go through the Masechet. Yes, Aaron?
Rabbi, say that again. I thought you couldn't have relations until you went into the mikvah.
You can't. I'm saying that perhaps I made that a little confusing. What I was trying to clarify is that it is not her tum'ah that makes intimacy off limits. That a woman is both an av hatuma, meaning that she can cause ritual impurity from the highest level, but she is also separate from, parallel, not able to engage in intimacy without violating a mitzvah. So yes, she still has to go to the mikveh, and we'll talk about how that all gets, how the procedure for ending this process is. But I wanted to make sure that people understood it is not the ritual impurity, the tum'ah, that makes her prohibited as a sexual partner. The prohibition on sexual intimacy is its own discrete mitzvah. Okay, that was the only point I was trying to make. Once a woman becomes niddah, zava, or gives birth, she remains tameh until she follows the required procedure and immerses herself in the mikveh, as we discussed during our study of Masechet Mikveh. The punishment for cohabiting with a niddah who has not immersed in a mikveh is the same, whether she is presently menstruating or it has been years since she last menstruated, meaning that the ritual impurity and her status as a niddah does not officially end until she has immersed in a kosher mikveh. And if her ritual impurity, if the cause of her ritual impurity, her monthly cycle, her childbirth, whatever it might be, happened last week or it happened 10 years ago, her status remains the same until she goes to the mikveh. That's what that's trying to tell us. Now, we will discuss the particulars of each of these types of tumah, and one must bear in mind that these laws do not represent practical halakha, as these matters are subject to various additional laws, restrictions, and customs. This is known as the don't try and actually follow the Mishnah that we're going to study. There is a big gap, as I mentioned a little bit a while ago, between how contemporary communities that are observant follow the mitzvot of Tahara Mishpacha, this whole category, and how the Mishnah is going to describe it. And many contemporary, especially Orthodox communities, will often struggle to explain why the way we observe it, which is much more restrictive than the way it was discussed in the Mishnah, is followed. And so the introduction here is coming out to make very clear, all the what would appear to be leniencies that are going to be found in this Masechet would not be followed in a contemporary Orthodox community, to say the least. So that's what that last little paragraph is trying to tell you. Again, the Masorah translation is from an Orthodox source. That's why they are especially interested in preventing you from coming to the wrong conclusions, even though you'd be following the Mishnah itself. All right, so category number 1, Niddah. What is this from? Well, this is from Leviticus 15:19. When a woman has a flow or a discharge, blood flowing from her flesh, from her body, not like from an arm wound, but from inside herself, she shall be in her state of Niddah for a 7-day period, and anyone who touches her shall remain tameh until the evening. So what does this mean? Well, when blood is released from a woman's womb, she becomes a Niddah. That is a now technical category for her status. She remains tameh for 7 days, regardless of how many discharges she had during those days and how long they lasted. So just as a brief summary, we'll look at this in much more detail throughout our studies in this Masechet. So if she sees the first sign of discharge on Monday, and then she sees another sign on Tuesday, and sees another sign on Wednesday, and so, from the first day, she starts counting. And it doesn't matter that she has additional discharges and evidence of blood flow during those 7 days. As long as she is done, as long as the blood flow has entirely stopped at the end of the 7th day, biblical law, deoraita, allows her to immerse herself in the mikveh the night following the 7th day and become tahor. She observes that 7th day of separation. 8th day, she goes to the mikveh. In the night of the 8th day, then, she can separate at the end of the 7th day. She can then go to the mikveh because that's the new day, right? It's the beginning of the 8th day is the night after the 7th day because the Hebrew calendar is different than the secular. And then the following day, she can become tahor, ritually purified. So that is the technical status of Niddah. Now, as you're going to maybe be aware, this idea that you count 7 days, and then at the end of the 7 days, you immerse, and it doesn't matter how many additional discharges there are during that 7 days, is not the way that Niddah is normally observed. Instead, in the contemporary world, Niddah is normally observed as though it were a zavah, that this is the standard for all types of discharges. And a woman, again, we're in Vayikra 15, and a woman, if a discharge of her blood will flow for many days outside of her Niddah period, meaning not during the normal time that Niddah would occur, or if she has a flow after her Niddah period, all the days of her tameh flow shall be like the days of her Niddah period. She is tameh. So her status is that she is like somebody who is in her monthly cycle, even though this is happening outside of the cycle. Now, what does that mean inside and outside? Well, following the 7-day Niddah period, the normal 7 days of the monthly cycle, when the blood flow is likely to be witnessed, the woman enters an 11-day period of potential ziva. That is to say, now it would be unusual if there is going to be an additional discharge. So once the normal period of her menstruation finishes, then any subsequent menstruation during the immediate 11 days afterwards would be abnormal. And thus, if that happens, she becomes a zavah. That means she is now in this unusual status. So during those 11 days, any blood released from her womb causes her to become tameh as follows. If the blood was released on just 1 or 2 consecutive days, she becomes immediately tameh and must observe 1 clean day. A clean day means 1 day entirely free of blood. She is known as a zavah ketana, or a minor zavah. And that means she is a woman who observes a day free of discharge against a day which she discharged blood. A minor zavah may immerse herself on that clean day. I mean, once she's had that full clean day, then, and no discharges happen, then she can go to the mikveh straight away and she's fine. Minor zavah may immerse herself on that clean day and may resume relations with her husband that night. If she experiences a discharge on the 3 consecutive days, she becomes a zavah gedolah, a major zavah, who must count 7 clean days before becoming tahor. In addition, after she purifies herself in the mikveh, she must bring a set of korbanot to the Beit HaMikdash. So if you are having 3 days of a discharge in this 11-day post-menstrual period, then you're going to have to wait until the last discharge happens and then attach an additional 7 days on top of that are clean with no additional discharges, which, as you can imagine, would extend the time considerably for the resumption of her purification. Now, if 11 days pass without the woman becoming a major zava, or if she became a major zava, she has since counted 7 clean days, her next release of blood after the 11 days will make her a niddah. She then starts the 7/11 day cycle once again. So once that 11 days has gone past, then if she sees a flow of blood again, we assume now that this is simply, for example, if it was on the 12th day, a very early onset of her next menstrual cycle, rather than an abnormal flow, which would make her a zava. So that's the distinction that they're talking about. She goes back into the window of waiting for her next menstruation, and when that begins, then we consider her to be a niddah, and that means that it's the normal 7 days of discharge expected, and then the immersion at the end of that 7 days. Okay, any questions about that general practice? Because we need to have these terms kind of clear in our head, because knowing whether or not a woman is niddah in her regular monthly cycle or in zava, meaning that she is having an abnormal flow of one form or another, is kind of a big deal in the Masechet, in this section of the Mishnah. So I want to make sure we have at least the basic outlines. We'll get into how do you tell the difference in much more detail throughout the discussion, but I want to make sure that the basic idea, Niddah is the normal menstrual cycle, zava is the abnormal discharge outside of that cycle. Yes, Aaron.
So, Rabbi, if they, it's basically one discharge outside the cycle, you're minus ziva, 3, or at least the equivalent of 3, and you become a ziva gadol.
Gedolah, exactly, zava gedolah. So if it's 1 or 2 consecutively, then she is still in the minor status. And if the next day is not discharging, then she can go to the mikveh and after that clean day, and she is fine and back to ritual purity. On the other hand, if she has 3 consecutive days out in this zava status, then it doesn't matter if day 3 was the final day. She has to count 7 clean days, not just 1, before she can go to the mikveh. All right, and then as I mentioned before, we see the commentary at the bottom here. In order to avoid mistakes, it became the practice already in Talmudic times to treat all women who see any blood as a major zava, a zava gedolah. Thus, every woman is required to count 7 clean days, no matter how long she discharges blood. Now, that's not going to be the way the Mishnah talks about this. That is a middle Talmudic discussion that eventually becomes common practice, which is why if you've talked about Tahara Mishpacha with me or other modern authorities on this, they'll tell you that when a woman goes into her regular cycle, she will notice when the blood flow stops, then she will count 7 days from the end, and then she will go to the mikveh, which, as you know, from our discussion now, that is treating this as a zava gedolah. If it was just a straight niddah, then it would be 7 days. It started on this day, and you just count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and it's done. And it doesn't matter how much happens in the middle. If it happens after those 7 days, then yes, then it can still be a zava situation. But like I said, the contemporary practice is very different. It's like that bottom paragraph there, and we'll talk about that in more detail when we finish the whole Masechet. And Aaron, I think you have a continuation question.
Yes, Rabbi. It was just to clarify, any blood during those 7 days during your regular menstrual cycle is considered normal blood and just niddah, not ziva, right?
Exactly right. Exactly. So if you bleed all 7 days and then stop, then you can go to the mikveh. But that's not considered to be an irregular flow at all. It's considered to be the normal expectation. Although for most women, having a discharge all 7 days would be unusual. And we will talk about shortly, in fact, how that regular period can sometimes be determined. All right, but let's talk about our third category of ritual impurity that comes from blood from the womb. And that is a yoledet, a woman who has given childbirth. When a woman conceives and gives birth to a male, then she shall be tameh for 7-day period, as during the days of her Niddah infirmity shall she be tameh. Now, it doesn't go at, this quote doesn't bring the entirety of it, because if there is, well, sorry, it does actually at the bottom. Sorry, my mistake. And for 33 days, she will remain in blood of tahara. She may not touch anything holy, and she may not enter the sanctuary until the completion of her tohar days. If she gives birth to a female, she shall be tameh for 2 weeks, as during her Niddah period. And for 66 days, she shall remain in blood of tahara. I talked about this in more detail just recently when we went through Tazria Metzora in my Wednesday Lunch and Learn class. So you can go back and look up those videos if you want to get more information about this. But here is the basic summary. The basic biblical laws that apply to a woman who gives birth to a child or miscarries a fetus after 40 days for conception are as follows. She is tameh, like a niddah, for the first 7 days after the birth of a boy, and for 14 days after the birth of a girl, even if no blood came out during childbirth. The assumption is that there was some bleeding, even if it wasn't noticed or observed directly. Afterwards, she may immerse in a mikveh and may then engage in cohabitation. If she releases blood during the next 33 days, if she gave birth to a boy, or 66 days, if she gave birth to a girl, she does not become tameh. So there is a window following that initial 7 or 14 days, that any blood that is seen is considered to be a normal residual bleeding from the act of childbirth, and is not considered to be a discharge that would render her ritually impure. So that means that during that 33 or 66-day period, she is said to be Yoshevet al Dam Tohar. She is observing, she is sitting through the days of Tohar blood, of ritually pure blood. When her Tohar days end, she must bring a set of korbanot to the Beit HaMikdash. Again, obviously in the ancient world when the altar still stood. Nowadays, again, this publication wants to make sure that we know that this is not the way we currently handle it. Nowadays, the universal custom is to treat blood of the Tohar days as a regular discharge. Therefore, she must count 7 clean days before immersing herself in a mikveh. So it eventually became the practice, rather than observing the, quote, leniency, the framework that the Torah describes, to just say, look, let's just treat this as though it were a regular time period, rather than having the special allowances that were given in the Torah. And if there is a discharge, we will treat it as though it were a abnormal discharge, make her a zava gedolah, count 7 days, and then we will allow her to go to the mikveh again. Now, you can see the Oraita and from the Mishnah, that was not necessary. In the Torah, as well as the Mishnah, if you are during this window of 33 or 66, no additional immersion is needed during that time. Yes, Aaron?
And it's just 7 days. They don't extend it to 14 days for a girl?
No, because they're not considering this to be connected to the pregnancy cycle or the childbirth cycle. They are considering this just as though it is ziva, an irregular discharge. All right, so let's talk about some of the general terms that we're going to need to have in our tool set before we get into the Masechet. And I apologize for the lengthy introduction. Normally we dive right into a Mishnah. We've already gone half an hour and we're not quite done yet, but I know that this Masechet is going to introduce a lot of unfamiliar terms to both many of my students who may not have much knowledge about this bodily function, but it also introduces a number of technical terms that we need to be aware of, because technical terms don't always behave the way we think. For example, ro'ah. This is a technical term because literally it means she sees. And this term is used throughout the tractate in a variety of senses. It can refer to a woman actually discharging blood, to finding her blood on a cloth that she used to examine herself internally, or to her finding a bloodstain on her body or garment. So all three of those are an issue of ru'ah. In different cases, we will talk about them. So when it says, and she sees, or that she discovers, or she becomes aware of, even though it literally means seeing, sometimes it will happen that it's not literally seeing the actual discharge in her body or from her body. So the term is more like she becomes aware of or discovers, would maybe be another way of putting it in English. Bidika, examination. Again, this is going to have a more technical framework to it. This generally refers to an internal examination in which the woman wraps a cloth around her finger, inserts it, and then carefully wipes around. She then inspects the cloth for any traces of blood. Such an examination must be performed by a Niddah before she can immerse herself in the mikveh, and by a Zava before she can begin counts her clean days, as well as during her clean days, meaning to make sure they remain free of discharge. So this examination is a critical component. Now you can notice that the Niddah only has to do this before she goes to the mikveh. That's because there's no issue about any discharge of blood during those 7 days for somebody that is Niddah according to the Torah. The only important thing is that she no longer be discharging by the time she's going to the mikveh. The Zava, on the other hand, as we talked about, has a different benchmark, and we have to make sure that we are constantly aware of her current status, because it will reset that clock for clean days if there is another sign. Additional examinations are required for a woman who is involved with tohorot, meaning with sanctified items, and at the time when a woman's period is expected. And as you can see, many of these are going to be discussions throughout our Masechet. The other word we need to know from this page is eid, or edim. This refers to the examination cloth that a woman uses to examine herself internally. It is based on the expression from Isaiah 64, beged edim, a discarded cloth. Or, alternatively, it is derived from the word eid, meaning witness, as it attests to the woman's tumah or tahara. And then we get to our ketem, which is the technical term for the sign of blood. The sages decreed that a woman is tameh if she finds a blood stain on an area of her body or clothing where blood from the womb may have dripped. Since this decree is rabbinic in origin, it's de Rabbanan, the sages were lenient and did not consider a blood stain tameh if there is a possibility that it came from a different source. As you can see, we'll talk about that in chapter 8. And finally, veset. Veset means a fixed period, and it means, or it's referring to the fact that a menstrual cycle may follow a fixed pattern. For example, it may be prompted by a certain day of the Jewish month, or a specific interval of days, or it may come along with certain physical symptoms. This is the same pattern that you'll find in the modern world as well, that many women will have an extremely regular cycle. Not every woman will have the same cycle, and it is an old urban legend that women will synchronize their cycles. That simply does not take place. But each woman may know that her cycle is the normally 28 or 28 and a half days, or that it always comes after certain physical symptoms begin to manifest themselves. And as the Jewish month is generally about the same length, for some women it could even be on the same day of the Jewish month, because Jewish months are more regular and shorter on average than most Gregorian months. So this was something that could be predicted. Now, not every woman has this. Again, there's often a misconception about this. Many women have a less regular cycle, meaning that it can vary by a few days to even longer. Some women can have very delayed onset. Some people can have much shorter onset. That's normal. It's less predictable, which, as we'll see for halakha, does have implications. But it is not biologically bizarre. It is a normal occurrence that simply has a different implication when it comes to certain parts of the law. If the woman has established such a pattern, the next menstruation will presumably follow the same pattern. Thus, it can be assumed that her next flow will come at that time or accompany those symptoms. The laws that apply to a woman with a fixed period are discussed at the beginning of chapter 1 and the end of chapter 9. Now, tractate Niddah is unique, the only tractate in Seder Tohorot to be treated directly in the Talmud. So what that's trying to say is that the Talmud, when being written, was ostensibly a commentary on the Mishnah. It has much more material in it than a straight commentary and explanation of the Mishnah itself. But that's the general framework, which is why if you look at a set of the Mishnah with all of its 6 orders and all of its mesechets, all of its tractates, and then you look at the Talmud, it's mostly a one-to-one connection, meaning you'll find Masechet Bava Kama in the Mishnah, and then you'll find a volume of the Talmud called Bava Kama, which is about that section. However, the Talmud, neither Jerusalem nor Bavli, cover every Masechet that is in the Mishnah. The Mishnah covers topics that do not appear as separate volumes in the Talmud. And one of those, some of those, a large number, come from the entire section on Tohorot, which the Mishnah covers in great detail, and which the Talmud does not seem to cover in as much detail directly. Niddah is the one exception to that, meaning that this is one whole section that is found at the end of the Talmud in its modern formatting, that is from the Mishnah and then in the Talmud, because it was considered so important, and was considered that additional explanation and discussion would be necessary. And that happened in both Bavli and Yerushalmi, which don't always agree about which other sections of the Mishnah get full volumes of the Talmud. You will notice also, as an aside, that it uses the phrase treated directly. The Talmud does talk about the topics contained in the other parts of Tohorot, of the Mishnah. It just doesn't devote entire volumes to them. Now, why? This is because its subject matter of Niddah is relevant with respect to the Niddah's permissibility to her husband. The rabbis were very, very diligent, wanting to make sure that no one would violate the mitzvah of Niddah, but also that no one would unnecessarily delay the reunion of intimacy between husband and wife because they didn't understand the restrictions of Niddah. So it is a classic example where if you are trying to be stringent in one way, you are being lenient on another. And if you try to be lenient in one way, you're going to be stringent on the other. If you're trying to be very strict in preventing a violation of 2 people from being intimate when there's a possible Niddah or Ziva situation, then you are being lenient on allowing them to be together, and vice versa. If you're always trying to find a way for them to be together, regardless of the evidence that's being presented, then you're also being lenient on protecting the mitzvah of Niddah. So it's not as simple as saying, I'm going to be strict. Now, because of all of this, the laws apply even today when the laws of Tumah and Tahara cannot be practiced, meaning that even though we are not as concerned about physical purity issues, because we don't have an altar in Jerusalem, we don't have the korbanot, we don't have the truma, we don't have all of the things that normally required a status of physical purity. And as I've talked about before, we lack the means of even creating that level of physical purity of true tahara. Most of Seder Toharot is of little practical implication. But because Niddah is not only about a woman's ritual impurity, but also about her permissibility for intimacy, that means that it is still of very much practical relevance, which hopefully explains again why I focused on that topic at the very beginning of this introduction. And then a little trivia fact. Meiri reports that because of the tendency to focus only on the study of the 3 Sidarim of the most practical significance, Moed, Nashim, and Nezikim, the 3 main sections of the Talmud that get most focus, some Geonim actually move Tractate Niddah to the end of Seder Nashim so that its study would not be ignored. to make sure that everybody kept that copy around and actually did study it, since many people would look at the end of these different Sdarim, these different sections of Mishnah, and say, I don't need to study that. That's all purity stuff. We're not worried about that. As such, they re-edited the order in order to make sure that people would not overlook it. Okay. Any questions before we jump into the Mishnah itself? Okay. I do recommend, if you go to Sefaria, you can read Dr. Kolp's fine introduction as well. It's a little bit more casual, which I find very inviting and helpful. However, it is also less precise, less logically structured, and harder to follow in some places. So if you read it now after having listened to the other introduction, it'll make a lot more sense. And so go ahead and give that a try at some point. But I want to make sure we get to our actual Mishnah. And then, of course, he brings in the different sections from Vayikra that talk about this topic. Okay. Mishnah 1:1 for Masechet Niddah. And as usual, I will remind everybody, never expect the Mishnah to start with first principles. The Mishnah was not written as an introduction book. The Mishnah was written as study notes for something you should have already heard in a lecture. That's not the way we do it, because we have a very different study technique nowadays. But that means that the Mishnah can often feel a little confusing when we start. But that's the point. It's not supposed to be studied by itself. It's supposed to be studied with the rest of the knowledge being shared around it. Shammai says, for all women, it suffices to reckon their period of uncleanness from their time of discovering the flow. Hillel ruled, their period of uncleanness is to be reckoned retroactively from the previous examination to the last examination, even if this was many days. All right, what is the machloket? What are they arguing about here? Excuse me. The argument here is, okay, we know that a woman will eventually discover that her cycle has begun, that there will be a discharge of blood at some point. But that generally would mean that she probably was also already beginning her cycle prior to this discovery. So wouldn't that mean that she should have been ritually impure prior to that? Now, what does that matter? Well, it matters because, as we'll see throughout our discussion in this Masechet, in this section of the Mishnah, a woman who is ritually impure, she can, as an Av Hatuma, transmit that impurity in a variety of different ways. So if she was already ritually impure, but we hadn't discovered it, then we would have to retrace her steps to unpack what had become ritually impure through her contact with it prior to her discovery of her discharge. Now, Shammai says no. Once she discovers that she is ritually unclean, meaning that she has discovered the blood, that is where her period of being tameh begins. She is tameh from that point forward, and we don't need to see where she was at any time prior. Hillel, on the other hand, argues very much a stringent opposite. Hillel says, no, we have to assume that from the moment she discovered to back in time to her last examination, that she was probably ritually impure, that she was already beginning her process of discharge during that entire period. Does that mean literally? Maybe not, because it depends on how long it could have been. And certainly we wouldn't have expected it to go on for months and months and months without there being evidence. But we have to assume that if she didn't check from the day or from the moment after she last checked until today, that all of that time period, she should be considered ritually impure retroactively, and anything she touched would have been thus rendered ritually impure according to the normal laws. Now, neither opinion of Shammai or Hillel win. The sages say, that is to say, the general Chachamim, the law is not like the words of these or the words of those. meaning both Shammai and both Hillel lose this argument. But the women are deemed to have been unclean during the preceding 24 hours, when this lessens the period from the previous examination to the last examination, and during the period from the previous examination to the last examination, when this lessens the period of 24 hours. Okay, so the sages are saying it's not like Shammai that says the Tumah begins now. That doesn't make sense. There is too high of a likelihood that she was indeed already beginning the cycle prior to her discovery. We need a little bit of a retroactive period. But Hillel, sorry, saying you go all the way back to the previous examination, even if it was many days, that's just, getting a little nutso there. Instead, we're going to have as our default 24 hours, meaning if you discover at 1 p.m. on a Tuesday, then you retroactively consider everything that was in contact with her from 1 p.m. on Tuesday back to 1 p.m. on Monday. That becomes the largest possible time that we would need to retroactively consider her to have been tameh. However, if there was an examination that happened less than 24 hours ago, then you would rule that it was between the examination and this examination. So if she examined herself yesterday afternoon or Monday afternoon at 4 p.m., and she then discovers that she is ritually impure Tuesday at 1 p.m., then you only have to backtrack to 4:01 p.m. on Monday. You don't have to go back the full 24 hours. Aaron, I see your hand is up.
Actually, just a quick historical question. In the time of the Mishnah, were they on a 24-hour clock?
Yes and no. So they had 24 hours, but they were not 24 hours of 60 minutes, identical 60 minutes time. They were 24 relative hours based upon the amount of time the sun was up during different times of the year. So a summer hour was much longer than a winter hour. But their clocks, their sundials worked that way. In fact, it's very easy to make a sundial work like that, much easier than the sundials that you often see as art installations, which are much more complicated to make, which simply divide the day into 12 daylight hours. So if I discover that I have begun the discharge at the second rabbinic hour, meaning the second relative hour of the day, then I would have to go back to the second relative hour of yesterday, which is about 24 hours. Not exactly precise, but about. I should point out that the Hebrew here does not say 24 hours. The Hebrew here, actually, I don't think it's going to show us here, is using the term 8, which means time. Let's just go ahead and bring that up because it's important. Oh, and it's not going to do that. Just a second. We'll do it in a separate column. And why are you not turning the Hebrew on for me? There we are. So you can see that the sages actually say that here we are actually talking me'et le'et, from time to time, which means from 24 hours, meaning from this time until that time, from the current hour back to that same hour in the previous day. So the translation, and in fact, I've seen this in many different translations now, they like to just go ahead and use the term 24 hours. But no, they didn't have a 24-hour, 60-minute clock back then. Does that help?
Yeah, that helps a lot.
Yeah, I know. The acronyms can sometimes throw you off, and that's perfectly understandable. I sometimes am also scratching my head of, the English is not hard to just say from this time to the previous time and then put in parentheses the same time the previous day. But I wasn't asked to edit the translation. Okay, so moving on through the rest of Mishnah 1. For any woman who has a regular period, remember we talked about the Veset, the woman who is in a state of awareness that she has a regular cycle, and we will talk about how that gets established later. If she has that regular cycle, it suffices to reckon her period of uncleanness from the time she discovers the flow. So this might be considered a leniency. that if she is regular, if it is very predictable of when her cycle will begin, then when she discovers it, we can assume to be about when it began. Because, if she thought it was going to begin early, then that would have been unusual. And she's not an unusual person, meaning, sorry, that's bad English. She is not a person with an unusual cycle. She is somebody with a very routine cycle, a very regular cycle. And that means we can measure it as starting when the cycle is actually demonstrating itself for her. And we then get into the topic of intercourse. And if a woman uses rags, meaning the normal examination, when she has sexual intercourse, this is like an examination, which lessens either the period of the past 24 hours or the period from the previous examination to the last examination. So that is to say, if she is checking herself both before and after intercourse in different cases, then that means that also can be considered a check. Now, why does this need to be described with the connection to intercourse? Well, because especially before intercourse, this might not be done as carefully as it should, and therefore you might not think that it was a full examination. But even more, after the fact, there would be other fluids, quite likely, that are in that area. And that means that it might be easy for her to miss any signs of blood that reckon the onset of the cycle. So the Mishnah has to come to tell us, no, indeed, that the examination is considered an examination, and thus it can be used to reckon our time for how much retroactively we have to say she was ritually impure. I'll give you a quick example. She discovers, like I said, her Tuesday, she discovers the sign of blood at 1 p.m. And then she says, well, that's strange because I didn't notice anything last night after I had sex. And I, was cleaning up and I did an examination and I didn't see any blood then. Okay, then. That means that we only have to retroactively consider her to have been ritually impure from just after the intercourse until the 1 p.m. slot and then going forward. We don't have to go all the way back for the full 24 hours. That post-coitus examination is considered sufficient for our last save point, to use a modern video game term. Our last milestone might be a more classic driving term. Yes, Aaron.
Weren't a lot of these rags used at night when it would be hard to tell the time?
Hard to tell the time, yes. Although they did have the advantage of the nightly watch, where someone would call out and let you know when things were. But more to the point, even if they weren't measuring down to the minute, and most of the world history was not concerned with minutes until we got very fancy clocks relatively recently, she would know, well, what did I do after that? Did I just go to bed? Did I go wandering around? Did I, start cooking something for tomorrow's, food? Was I, reading? So it isn't so much a precise, how many minutes ago did this happen? It's from that point until the point where she does the examination that reveals the sign of blood to show the onset. What other activities took place? If it happened to be mostly sleep, then, there's not much of a retracing of her steps required. That's really all they're worried about. They're not worried about it down to the minute. But obviously she would remember, oh yeah, I had sex, and everything before that would be considered perfectly fine. Nothing would have come into contact with her during her status. And everything after that would then be rendered ritually impure. And of course, most notably, that means that her husband would not have been in violation of sleeping with somebody in Niddah, because the examination immediately after established that she didn't have any signs. Obviously, if she had found a sign, then there are other ways to handle that, as we'll see throughout our study. Make sense?
That makes sense, Rabbi.
Okay. We're going to go ahead and stop there. I know it's very unsatisfying to only have one Mishnah in, but I really felt that we needed to get a strong, clear introduction. I hope I was able to provide that. We will get back to our normal pace and pattern of Mishnah by Mishnah by Mishnah, handling them as they come and wrestling with whatever information we have each day. So I look forward to seeing everybody as we continue next week and we get Niddah rolling. Take care, everyone, and thank you so much for joining.
Thanks, Rabbi.